the 24-70 f2.8 E lens with VR. Yes, this lens is so pro. Hey, these images are pretty good. Damn, bro. Actually have like bokeh and the clarity and contrast. Amazing. I mean, this lens just does it all. Landscape, portraits. It can even do wildlife photography. The most important thing in wildlife photography is that you look pro for your thumbnails. Guys, I'm 2 meters away from my subject. It has no idea I'm here. Just gotta get the shot. Family shots, baby photos. This is basically the lens that you can just take anywhere and get the shot. It's the perfect walk around lens. Although, I mean, if I really nitpick and I zoom in, I can see a little bit of chromatic aberration in the out of focus areas. And it is kind of soft at f2.8. But this is Nikon's best lens, so obviously I'm going to keep using it. This is just as good as it gets. Ooh, what's this? Nikon have announced a new 24-70 f2.8 Z-mount lens. Alright guys, so in all seriousness, this video is going to be about how the old 24-70 f2.8 E lens compares to the new 24-70 f2.8 Z lens. I have been using this lens for a while for like casual shooting, family, portraits, some landscape, stuff like that. I really like this lens. I can totally see why so many professionals love it. It's just dependable, reliable, everything works fast. You can pretty much just get the shot in any situation, and I think that's why this is such a good lens. It's so versatile. But it's not necessarily perfect. There have been quite a few reports of like bad copies out there. I personally went through 2 copies until I got to this version, which is actually sharp. And even then, it's not that sharp at f2.8. You still have to stop it down to like f5.6 to get really good sharp results. And the build quality has always been just a little bit questionable to me. Like little things like when you turn the focus ring, if you're zoomed in live view, you can actually see the image move up and down a bit. Like there's a bit of play in the mechanism. And for a high-priced professional quality lens, it just doesn't seem quite right. Also, there's a little bit of chromatic aberration affecting the out of focus highlights. That's the kind of thing that you can't easily just remove in Lightroom. So I really tend to gravitate towards lenses which don't have any longitudinal chromatic aberration, or at least very low amounts so that you don't notice it. You know, you don't really want to be pulling this out at like a family dinner or something, even though it is so good for that. It's just a massive lens. And for comparison, here's a 70-200 f2.8. It's almost as big. It does feel pretty solid and pretty pro. When you zoom, it doesn't change length. If you have the lens hood on, the part that extends actually is within the lens hood. So technically it does extend, but you don't see it. Alright, so I'm going to show you the new S lens now. It's actually mounted on that camera, so give me a sec, I just need to change lenses. So here's the 24-70 f2.8 S lens. As you can see, it's a lot smaller. It's also noticeably lighter. And it has a zoom mechanism that extends as you zoom 70mm, which is like more in line with like traditional zoom lenses. And it also has this little window on the top which shows you some information like focal length, aperture, focus distance. I kind of gonna call this a gimmick because I just don't find it that useful in practice. The only thing it's really good for is focus distance, because the focal length is right here on the lens. See, it says 24 millimeters. So we can easily tell what focal length we're at. I don't see why you'd want it mirrored here. The only nice thing it does do is it tells you very precisely what focal length you're at. So it'll tell you like 31.7 millimeters, which is cool. And the aperture is displayed on top of the camera, which is on a screen which is always on. The most annoying thing about this screen is it turns off after a while, and sometimes you'll be like tweaking the lens and looking at the focus distance and it will just turn off. And the way to turn it back on is to press DISP. And I don't know, I'd rather it just either stayed on all the time, or maybe when you turned one of the focus rings or something, it would then come on and show your focus distance. I just don't like it turning off when you're trying to use it. It's really annoying. And there's also a lens function button, which, to be honest, I haven't found a good use for, but I'm not calling this a gimmick. I'm saying this is probably really useful. I just personally haven't found a good use for it yet. And build quality, it is, I would say, about the same, maybe a little better than the older lens. It does have a nice solid feel to it. I'm not detecting any play, like when you turn the zoom or focus rings or anything like that. It just has a slightly more plain look, which arguably could be a good thing. I kind of like the gold ring lenses, but you know, this isn't a bad looking lens by any means. I kind of like it. Oh yeah, and then of course we have the, what is it called? Like the lens function ring or something. I can't remember the name of it. I kind of have mixed feelings about this. I can see that it's useful, but more often than not, I accidentally move it. It's not very stiff, so it's quite easy to like accidentally turn it a bit. But I'm sure it's going to be really useful for some things. Again, I just personally haven't quite found a good use for it yet. Exposure compensation is a good one, but yeah, just be careful you don't accidentally change it. And one of the other interesting things about this lens is the lens hood. So unlike the previous DSLR lens, this one is attached directly to the end of the extending barrel. So when you zoom in, the lens hood zooms with it. And it's actually a pretty nice lens hood. It has a button on the side so it locks into place. And I don't know if you can see on camera, but it actually has like, essentially like velvet, like black velvet on the inside of the lens hood. So in theory, I guess this should help increase contrast, decrease the amount of stray light reflecting and entering into the lens. And we also have this little auto and manual focus switch. I actually love this switch. I'm so glad they left this on the lens, because particularly for shooting video, I leave the Z6 with this lens on it in full-time autofocus, which basically just means that it'll just continuously focus whether or not I'm touching the camera. Make sure to disable the manual focus ring, because if you touch it while the camera's in AF mode, full-time autofocus, it'll actually disable the full-time autofocus and it will never come back on, even if you just slightly touch the manual focus ring. So I disable the manual focus ring when I'm in video, and then if I ever want to manually focus, I just click the switch to manual, and then I can manually focus, and then when I'm done manually focusing, I can just go back to auto and it will continue to focus. So I do like that about it. And when you look at the size of this lens, particularly when it's mounted on like the Z6, it's so much smaller. It looks more casual, you know, bringing it to like a family dinner, restaurant, taking it around town. It doesn't look like this massive professional camera necessarily, so I do kind of like that. So another kind of important thing about this lens for video is the focusing is super quiet. And you may have noticed actually, now that I've put the older E lens on my camera, you might be able to hear a bit of focusing. Yeah, that clicky buzzing sound, that's the autofocus motor tracking me as I move in and out. The camera's doing a great job, the lens is just a bit noisy, whereas this lens you don't hear it. So one of the difference, this is kind of a random one, but I think it's kind of important. The older E lens comes with a really nice case. It's solid, it's rugged, it has like a foam pad in the bottom so that when you put it down you're not putting the lens directly onto like a hard surface and potentially damaging it. So these cases are great. They're a bit bulky, but I mean, they do the job. Whereas the newer S lens, I'll show you the case it comes with. At first when I unboxed it, I was like, what the hell? I thought this was like a cleaning cloth or something, but this literally is the case that you put it in. It's kind of like this weird satchel type of design. At least you can get it in with the lens hood on, and then that covers over, and then you got your lens nice and protected. So I sort of have mixed feelings on this. On one hand, it's nice and small, it's going to protect it from like scratches and stuff like that. On the other hand, it does seem like they're cheaping out a little bit compared to the much more sturdy bags that you get with like the older DSLR lenses. So let's get down to the real meat of this video, the image quality. I'm going to go over to my computer. I've been shooting a few different scenes with both of these lenses and stuff like that, so I can get a bit more of like a direct comparison. I'm not really going to be going that much into sharpness. Like, yes, the S lens is a lot sharper than the older E lens, but there are loads of testing sites out there that test things like sharpness and vignetting. The things that really interest me are actually more like focus breathing, longitudinal chromatic aberration. If you're using a Nikon DSLR with the 24-70 f2.8 at the moment and you do a majority of your work on that lens, should you switch to the newer Z system? Because is this lens that much better? I don't think it's quite as clear cut as that. I can't just say like, yes, you should or no, you shouldn't. It depends on your situation. Like if you're shooting sports, you should probably stick with the DSLR because I think the focus is faster. And for portraits, I mean, yes, the Z systems have eye detect autofocus, which could be great, but I also think that the DSLRs already have really good autofocus. So for portraits, I don't think it's that easy to pick a clear winner. But if you're doing like landscapes, video, this lens is definitely better for those. Why am I doing like the summary at the beginning? Yeah, let's just get into the images on my computer. Alright, so here we are, I'm at my computer. I've got a load of test shots lined up. I tend to come into my kitchen for these kind of tests. I think it's because there's a nice balance of like contrasty light. You've got a bright window, you've got shiny metal surfaces. It's just a good way to see how a lens is performing and to pick up any problems with the like flare and chromatic aberration and stuff like that. I've already selected all of these files and reset their settings in Lightroom, and then I've turned off sharpening, chromatic aberration, noise reduction, things like that, just to make sure they're all completely even and equal. So the only thing changing between these shots are the lens, but just be aware that it was a sunny, cloudy kind of day, so the lighting did change a little bit here and there, shot to shot. But it shouldn't be too bad for these tests because we're not trying to test light gathering performance at the moment. We'll do that next. This is the Z lens, and you can see it says Nikon Z 24-70 f2.8s. So that's how you can tell the difference if you get lost at any point. Just look up here and you can see which lens I'm talking about. So this is basically a direct comparison between the older E lens for DSLRs and the new Z lens for mirrorless. So one of the things I'm noticing is I think the rendering of the older lens is just a little bit warmer. It has a bit more of like a golden tone to it, a little bit more of a warm tone. That could be seen as a good thing or a bad thing, I don't know. It totally depends on what you're shooting. But if you're shooting raw, it's easy to change anyway. But let's zoom in and have a look at, I guess, sharpness. Now, to me, the newer S lens does look sharper. I think it's easier to see where the focal plane is. And if you look up at these areas up here, you can really see this sharp detail. It actually almost looks like there's a bit of moire in the sort of detail on the plastic handle, whereas if we look at the older lens, it's just a bit more blurry, a bit more soft. There isn't really that nice sharp defined focal plane, so it's a little bit harder to sort of get the focus where you want it with this lens. And remember, this is just on the Z6. If you have the Z7, it's actually going to be even more sharp and noticeable, the difference between these two lenses. So it just goes to show that you don't need a very high resolution camera to show the difference between two good lenses. The lens is so important as to how sharp your picture is. It doesn't really matter on the megapixels of your camera. It really does come more down to the lens, to the perceived sharpness of your image. So bear that in mind, at least up to a certain point anyway. And let's have a look at the bokeh. So I definitely think that the newer Z lens does have nice soft bokeh compared to the older lens, and you'll see that a bit more clearly in some of the later images. Just looks, you see up here some of these highlights are a bit busy, they have some weird edges, whereas the newer lens, everything just looks a bit softer, a bit more creamy. And also you can see the same thing on the tap here. The edges of the out of focus areas are just a bit softer, a bit less defined, looks smoother compared to the older lens. We can see some harsher edges, some chromatic aberration like green fringing showing up in there as well. And that's longitudinal chromatic aberration. You can't fix that in Lightroom just by clicking a button. You can see it a bit more here around these rim highlights. There's a little bit of a red colouring here, and there's actually, I think you can just about see a tiny bit of green on this side. So that's longitudinal chromatic aberration. It just adds colours where there shouldn't be colours. On the newer lens, you can see, you can't really see any. Looks very clean, very nice. So we're going to have a look at the next two images. The only difference here is that I was shooting at f/5.6 instead of f/2.8. I think with the older lens here, I may have been focused a little bit further back than I intended to be, which is sort of more in the middle. But I still think that if you compare both of these, even at f/5.6, the newer S lens still does seem to have a little advantage in sharpness. Now the older lens does seem to have maybe a tiny bit more background blur. I think that's, again, it comes down to either the focus breathing or the fact that the lens is just a little bit further forward on the camera, so it's actually a bit closer. Probably some combination of those two things. It's only a subtle difference, but it's worth bearing in mind. Okay, so now we're at 24mm f/2.8, and again the older lens is on the left, the newer S lens is on the right. And here, because we're at 24mm, we got a much wider field of view, so I actually moved a bit closer. And you can see that because the older lens is much bigger, it comes much closer to the scene, so that's why it appears that it's everything is a bit bigger in the frame. As you'll see a bit later, this probably isn't down to focus breathing, this is only down to the lens just being bigger and a bit closer to the scene. Let's zoom in and have a look at sharpness. Again, on the old lens, it's kind of hard to place the focal plane exactly where you want it. You sort of have to just keep tweaking the focus ring back and forward. Whereas with the newer lens, I feel like the focal plane is just a bit sharper, a bit more obvious to get it where you want it. So at 24mm, there's definitely not such a big difference compared to at 70mm, but I still think that the newer lens has an advantage in sharpness. And you can really see it down here on like the edges of the blades here. Compared to on this side, it's just a bit softer. Oh, and let's have a look at bokeh. So, you know, now at 24mm, I don't think there's a massive difference. Maybe it's just a tiny bit smoother on the S lens. Like if you have a look at some of these highlights around here, they look quite smooth. I'm not seeing a lot of harsh edges, whereas on the older lens, maybe it's just a little bit more of like a rim around the edges. But at the end of the day, let's be honest, at 24mm, you're not really going to get much bokeh, so it's nice if it's a bit softer, but it doesn't really make a big difference. And again, in terms of chromatic aberration, I'm definitely seeing more longitudinal chromatic aberration on the older lens in the out of focus areas. You can actually see it, if I zoom in even a bit more, let's go into 3:1. Have a look on this metal band here. You can see on the older lens there's a big purple highlight along this metal band here. I'm actually not quite sure if that's longitudinal or lateral chromatic aberration, but either way, the old lens has it, the new lens doesn't. And again, if we look at like the metal of this tap, you can see there's definitely some coloration on the edges of these out of focus areas, and the newer S lens seems to be free of it. Now the older DSLR lens definitely isn't one of the worst lenses for chromatic aberration. It's kind of mediocre. It's not that bad, it's not that good. But I am really impressed with the new lens. It seems to have it really well controlled, so good job, Nikon. Okay, same thing, 24mm. This time we're at f/5.6. Let's check sharpness. Now at this point, I think the sharpness, I'm not seeing a big difference. Like, I think the focal plane is maybe around here on the older lens, and maybe it's hard to say. I'm not seeing a big difference in sharpness. Maybe the new lens still has a tiny edge, but at this point you'd probably need a higher resolution camera like the Z7 to really notice a big difference. And again, there is a tiny bit of longitudinal chromatic aberration, but it's not nearly as bad at f/5.6. Okay, so now let's have a look at flare resistance, aka contrast. So again, on the left we got the older DSLR lens, on the right we got the new S lens, and we're both at 70mm f2.8. And because in my kitchen the lighting was changing so much, I came into a much darker part of my flat and shut all the doors, and I just put this artificial light source on so that I could take pictures and have consistent lighting in each shot. So this will be a better way to show flare, and we're also going to do some light transmission tests. So if you have a look at both of these images, it might not be immediately obvious at first, but I think I'm definitely detecting that there's more of this veiling flare spilling into these darker areas. And I think that the newer lens is controlling it a little bit better. I'll zoom in to see if we can make this a bit more obvious. I'll zoom in even a bit more. So I think it's really clear that this area up here isn't as dark as it should be, whereas maybe it's not perfectly controlled on the new lens either, but it is a lot better. And you can also much more clearly see the chromatic aberration on the older lens compared to the new lens. This gap here should be completely black. So the Z lens isn't doing a great job, but it's doing a much better job than the older lens where it's almost, you barely can even see it. And I also noticed that if we look at this area over here, you can definitely see again the older lens has more chromatic aberration. The new lens seems to be mostly free of it. And this just looks darker and more contrasty. Okay, now this is the same thing except we've stopped down to f/5.6, so 70mm f/5.6, old lens on the left, new lens on the right. Now I think if anything the difference is even more apparent. I'm definitely seeing more contrast on the new lens. The dark shadows just look a lot darker, whereas I think the older lens there's a lot more flare spilling into these dark areas. And because we're now stopped down at f/5.6, you can see the chromatic aberration is mostly gone. I'm not really seeing much, if any, on either of these images. I just think the detail is just sharper and more defined on the new lens compared to the old lens. Alright, I was going to have a look at vignetting on both lenses, but I can't really do it because, or I don't have the confidence that I can do it, because of the way the Z6 automatically applies profile corrections in Lightroom with no way to turn them off. Although I'm seeing some differences between f2.8 and f/5.6, this is with the old lens by the way. I'm not sure how much of this is profile corrections and how much is actually the lens's optics. So I'll probably skip this one for now, but there are loads of other testing sites out there that test things like vignetting, so maybe go and check those out. Here's the same thing with the Z lens. It looks like the vignetting isn't as bad, it just pushes right up into the corners a bit more compared to the old lens. But again, I'm not sure how much of that is down to the profile corrections set in Lightroom by default that you can't turn off. So yeah, can't really come to any conclusion on this at the moment. So this is essentially light transmission. Some people call this T-stops. If a lens doesn't have very good optics, then it will lose some light as the light is coming in, so the sensor won't actually receive as much light. And I think we're seeing that here a little bit. The old lens does look a little bit dimmer than the new lens, but it's not by much. I think maybe a quarter or a third of a stop at most. So yeah, here I'm zoomed right in and you can see maybe a quarter of a stop difference. The new lens does look a little bit brighter, just not much. And here is the same thing but at f/5.6. And again, if I zoom in, I think there is a little bit more brightness coming through the new lens, but again, it's not a big difference, maybe a quarter of a stop. And also probably just a difference in the color, which also affects it slightly. So in terms of light transmission, not a big difference between these two lenses, but the Z lens might still have a little bit of an advantage. So if you do a lot of low light shooting, the Z lens does seem to be letting through at least a bit more light, so something to bear in mind. So yeah, the newer lens does seem to be kind of kicking butt here in general. Now let's move on to some focus breathing tests. Now typically focus breathing is seen as a bad thing because it means that a lens that you bought, which is supposed to be say 70mm or 200mm, when you focus on something up close, like a person for a portrait, you'll actually only be at maybe, instead of 200mm like you should be, you might only be at 135mm. I have also seen quite a few lenses which do the opposite. They focus breathe the other way, so as you focus closer, they actually lengthen their focal length. And it's quite interesting actually what I found when I compared the focus breathing on these two lenses, so let's take a look. So here I'm showing the older DSLR lens, this is the E lens, and we're at 24mm f2.8. So now I'm zooming into minimum and back to infinity. So as I zoom into minimum, notice around the edges how the focal length actually decreases. So you end up with a wider field of view than you should have. And now I've just stopped down to f22 so that you can see even more clearly how at minimum you get a wider field of view than you do at infinity. Now the interesting part, when we zoom in to 70mm, I'm at minimum, now at infinity. Minimum, infinity. You can't see it too much here because there's so much bokeh at 70mm f2.8 at minimum focus distance. I'm actually going to stop it down to f22 and we're at minimum. Now we can see a bit more clearly what's going on when we zoom into infinity. So here we're at infinity, here we're at minimum. So what you'll notice is that we're actually zooming in a bit when we go to minimum focus. So this is the opposite of what people usually think of when they think of focus breathing. We're actually increasing the focal length as we zoom into minimum focus. And this is great because at minimum focus distance at 70mm, you're going to be getting a longer focal length, you're going to get more background blur, so this is good for portraits. And now the other interesting thing is that because this lens focus breathes in one direction at 24mm and in the other direction at 70mm, there's actually a point at around 50mm where it doesn't focus breathe at all. It's kind of the crossover point. So that's what I'm showing here. I've zoomed to something around 50mm and you'll see as I change focus, we're at f22 again here, so you can see the focal length doesn't really change at all. So that could be useful maybe if you're doing some filming and you don't want any focus breathing. Use around 50 to 55mm, I think is the point where I found where there's no focus breathing. So now the new lens, let's take a look just so we can see what's going on. So we're at 24mm f2.8 infinity and we'll zoom into minimum. Infinity, minimum. I think we need to stop down here to f22 to really see what's going on, because I'm not seeing a big difference. So yeah, we're getting, I would say, mild focus breathing as you would expect. So as we zoom to minimum, we're getting a very slight widening of the field of view. So this is not bad by any means. This is a pretty good result, I would say. Now let's zoom into 70 and see if we get the same thing. This is focused by wire, this lens, so it's a little bit slower actually to zoom all the way from minimum to infinity. Let's go down to f22 so we can see what's going on a bit more. So we're at infinity. This is definitely not like severe focus breathing, but there definitely is some focus breathing at 70mm that's quite noticeable, so something to bear in mind. And unlike the older lens, it focus breathes in the same direction at 24mm and at 70mm. So there we have it. So the newer S lens is giving a great performance with very few downsides compared to the older DSLR lens. Now there are still a few situations where I think the older lens would be better, like I think I said earlier, like sports photography, potentially portraits. But I think honestly it's so hard to go wrong with the new lens. The better sharpness, the better contrast, the lack of chromatic aberration, slightly better low light performance. There are a lot of benefits to like here. So if I was getting into a new system and I was using the 24-70 f2.8 as my main lens, I'd definitely be very attracted to this new 24-70 f2.8 S lens. So yeah, I think that's all we've got time for today. Ultimately, both lenses are great lenses. You can't really go wrong with either one. I just think if you want the best one at the moment, it does definitely seem to be the S lens for most uses. Now I'm sure some people are going to say like, well, the S lens is like clinical, like it doesn't have the character of the older lens. If you think that, then fair enough, that's completely fine. If you prefer the rendering of the older lens, get the older lens because it is amazing. It does have amazing rendering characteristics. But if you don't like chromatic aberration, flare, things like that, if you want the cleanest possible image, then I think the new lens is the one for you. So I hope you found this video informative. If you did, please leave me a like and subscribe if you want to see more. I'll put in a notification at the top of the screen which will take you to my Gear Talk playlist. I've got other videos like this about other lenses, so please check that out. I also do a lot of wildlife photography, so if that's something that interests you, you can check out some of my vlogs. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one. Bye.